I've been studying railroads in the U.S., and it occurred to me why there is not a transcontinental railroad company in the U.S. And this came up also earlier this year. One of the iconoclasts on trains started an article about why they need to have a transcontinental railroad, and then he finished the article by saying, "No, they really shouldn't do it because they get too big and they'd be, anyway." So people haven't figured out. So anyway, tonight I'm gonna go over what this magic east-west line that I've been talking about is. Where is the line in 1950? The major railroads in 1950, and we'll talk about the Canadians, and then the exceptions to the line, and then what's happened after 1950. So there's the railroads in the kind of the standard railroad map, and so I looked at the earlier in the 1900s, and I figured out that there's a magic line. It goes down Lake Michigan, and then goes down the Illinois River, and it goes down the Mississippi River. And the railroads east of that are east railroads, and the railroads west of that are west railroads. And it's always been that way. So there it is in the whole United States, 1950. And so east of the line in 1950, the five big railroads were the Pennsy, the New York Central, the B&O, the C&O, and the Southern. And of course, the Pennsy, I think that typifies the Pennsy as the 4-track main going from New York to Washington, GG1s pulling trains at 100 miles an hour. I mean, it was a big railroad. It was surprising how much bigger the Pennsy was than the other railroads in 1950. It's huge. And they went from New York to Philadelphia, and then of course down to Washington and Baltimore, and then to Pittsburgh, and then they had a line to Chicago, and then they had a line to Columbus, and then down St. Louis, and then various other lines to Louisville, Cincinnati, and then up to Mackinac City to run the ferry up to the DSS&A. And they, of course, went to Buffalo and Erie and all the places on the lake to bring ore in and send coal out. But it's a huge railroad. But if you'll notice, everything is east of the magic line from Chicago, Peoria, St. Louis. New York Central, I took that picture in it's a far cry from the earlier 20th Century Limited, but that was in 67 in Chicago. New York Central, similar map, but obviously the big difference they always advertise as the water level route is Commodore Vanderbilt built from assembled railroads from New York to Albany and then across, sort of following the Erie Canal, which really doesn't have a lot of hills. And then he got the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, which brought him to Chicago. And then, of course, the Michigan Central up here, which got him to Buffalo and up into Michigan. And then, of course, the Big Four, which is the Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. And so New York Central is probably 2/3 as big as the Pennsy. It was a good sized railroad. It was bigger than the other roads in the country. The B&O, Baltimore and Ohio. I took this in Lima, Ohio in 1970. And note the paint scheme. It's very interesting to see what's happened with that. But the Baltimore and Ohio was the first railroad in the United States. And their line starts in New York. They run on the Reading down to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And then they go to Washington, Baltimore. And then they had a line up to Chicago and various other cities. And then that main line went to Cincinnati and then St. Louis. And so it's been an old railroad, and they made it through the Depression into the 70s, and then the C&O bought it. Now this line here, I sort of thought a lot of the B&O had been ripped up. And in about 2002, I was working near Pittsburgh. So I was taking the Three Rivers. I'd go down to Chicago on the Empire Builder, and then I'd go from Chicago to Pittsburgh on the Three Rivers. And, we pull out of Chicago and it stops. And then they pull out another mile and they stop. And I'm sitting there and I thought, well, I had a sleeper because I had to work the next day. And so I went to bed and I woke up and it was middle of the night and it was just absolutely motionless in the car. And then I kind of, we stopped again. And I go, oh, what's that noise? And I look outside and we're doing 79 miles an hour. It was the smoothest track I have ever been on, double track, CTC, and I was very happy that the chassis and the CSX had rebuilt the old B&O. I mean, it was absolutely fabulous, fabulous ride all the way down. So I did it several times. But that's the B&O. The C&O took this in Chicago in the late 60s. They were more profitable. They had better coal. They had higher margins, and so they ended up having more money, and they bought the B&O as well as some other railroads. And so the Chessie C&O went from Norfolk and Newport News across basically to Cincinnati and Louisville. And then they got other railroads and went up to Toledo and Detroit, and then of course to Chicago, and then they took over the Pierre Marquette, which was a big railroad. And of course the Pierre Marquette had the car ferries, which Chessie continued to operate for a long time. And you know, we talk about our magic line coming down Lake Michigan. Well, that actually was an exception because they crossed into the west zone, if you will. And we took the Badger in the early 80s, and they pull into Milwaukee, and there's a C&O SW7 and a C&O yard in Milwaukee, and they unloaded the cars. And I thought, boy, that's C&O's right in Wisconsin there. And so C&O, of course, went to Chessie, and then they did the so-called stealth scheme. I have no idea what they were thinking. I know they were sort of honoring the gray of the South and the blue of the Union, but the rail fans called this the stealth scheme. I think this is off the internet too. I'd never seen one quite that stealthy. If it's a foggy day, that's coming at you, boy, I see what they're talking about. The lawyers must have had a field day. So anyway, then they said, well, gee, we better add some collision protection. So they went to yellow and still honoring the gray and the blue. And then for some reason, now they're right back to where they were in the 60s, blue and yellow. So I thought that was interesting. Kind of how, as we get to be our age, you see how things go full circle. So the Southern, of course, they went from Washington to Atlanta. And then, of course, they took over the central of Georgia, and then the New Orleans and Northeastern, they got that. And then, of course, the city of Cincinnati owned the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific, which, as I understand, they're now selling to the Southern, NS. But anyway, clearly, again, they're totally east of the line. So now the railroads in the Midwest that are west of the line, Northwestern, Burlington, Rock Island, and Missouri Pacific. And of course, the Northwestern, I took this in Sleepy Eye in 69 when that was one of the big flood years, as you can see. But the Northwestern, Chicago Northwestern, that is a great name, Chicago Northwestern. I mean, that pretty much sums it all up. And they too, like a lot of the railroads, were going to go to the Pacific Ocean. They built as far as Lander, Wyoming, and they were going to go through South Pass, south of the Tetons, and then on up into Portland through the Blue Mountains. But of course, they ran into financial problems, and it didn't happen. But they're pretty much west of the line. Thank you. I took this in St. Paul Union Depot in 1970, right after the merger. So the Burlington is definitely west of the line, with the exception of this little line that goes down to Paducah, Kentucky, and that's been a key railroad for Jim Hill. Of course, as you know, got into a big fight with Harriman about who was going to own it, because they both wanted the Great Northern NP and the UP both wanted a friendly connection in Chicago. They wanted to own their own line, and Hill won because he was more savvy with stock, and he had the money. And so later he was quoted as saying, I paid a lot more for the Burlington than I thought I would, but it made so much more money than because of course, the good connections, and then the line to Billings to connect with both the Great Northern and the NP. That worked out very well. And then, of course, in the 70s, when the Wyoming coal came in, about 40 for the last 20 years, 40% of the coal in the United States has come from Wyoming because it's low sulfur, low mercury, and very cheap to mine. Rock Island is another railroad. They're pretty much west of the line. And there, of course, their main line was Chicago to Kansas City to Tucumcari, where they connected with the SP. That's the Golden State. And then they went to Colorado Springs, and then trackage rights to Denver. And then, of course, the Twin Star line, which went from Minnesota, the North Star, to Texas, this One Star state. And so they basically went down to Kansas City, to Oklahoma City, and then down into Texas. And this line was sort of an obscure line they had from Tucumcari across to Memphis, and a lot of parts of it got torn up. Well, then later, the Southerners had to rebuild it because there's a lot of traffic going from LA to the southeast, to Atlanta and southeast. Yeah, they cobbled together a line. They use the Meridian and Bigby going across Mississippi, and yeah, they had to rebuild the thing. Mopac has become quite a large railroad from St. Louis. They built the main line, went to Little Rock and then down to Texas, and they got the Gulf Coast lines, and they had the Texas and Pacific, because Texas at the time had a law that if you had a railroad in Texas, it had to be headquartered in Texas. So that's why the Burlington had the Fort Worth and Denver City, and Santa Fe had Gulf Coast and Santa Fe, and all these others, Panhandle and Santa Fe. Later they dropped that, but as the companies got bigger. But they are definitely west of the line. And so that in terms of the Transcons west of the line, Great Northern, NP, Milwaukee, Santa Fe, Union Pacific, and Southern Pacific. Great Northern we're very familiar with. Jim Hill built from St. Paul across northern North Dakota and Montana. No land grants, and he was always profitable. Northern Pacific was built earlier, 10 years earlier, and it basically, I called it the Main Street of the Northwest because it was built early, and it has all the large cities: Fargo, Bismarck, Jamestown, Glendive, Miles City, Missoula, Butte, Helena, and they're all on the NP because the NP was built first. But again, it's definitely west of the line. I took this in Harlowtown in 1971, I think it was, and that typifies the Milwaukee. They, of course, they were the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul in this area. They had this area pretty well covered. And then they decided, well, we to compete with the Great Northern and the NP, we've got to go to the West Coast. The problem I was just reading recently is that the board and management played with the idea for about 10 years. So they originally got an estimate that was about $60 million for the land. And of course you wait 10 years and this area is growing, and the NP and Great Northern are going full blast. And so then the thing costs $260 million. Well, of course they were in financial trouble basically pretty much the whole time. And so then they cut off, they basically made Milwaukee 2 and abandoned all this track in the 70s. Miles City West. And then this part from Miles City to the South Dakota bought it, and now the Burlington Northern operates it, and they operate this line too. And it's quite a bit of traffic on that line. Santa Fe, they are very much west of the line because they go from Chicago, Kansas City, obviously across to Los Angeles, San Francisco, and down into Texas. And Union Pacific, the original UP, of course, the famous UP went from Omaha to Salt Lake City. And of course, there were a lot with the Credit Mobier, General Dodge and Durant played with a lot of money, but they did better than most railroads. I'll give them half the credit because they actually did build the railroad. I was reading that Jim Hill used, when he started the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, he used the charter for the Minneapolis and St. Cloud Railroad, which it was chartered by the legislature. And apparently they sold a bunch of stock and built 2 miles of track. And that was it. So, and that was typical for that time. There were railroads that never built. People bought stock and, well, good luck. And then of course they added the Kansas Pacific and Los Angeles and Salt Lake. And then of course they built up the Oregon, into Portland. Southern Pacific, it was an impressive railroad. They started with the CP, the Central Pacific, and then they built all the way from Portland to San Francisco to Los Angeles, all the way across to New Orleans. It was quite a railroad. And of course, they had the line up to Tucumcari where they connected with the Rock Island. And then they had a line that went all the way down to Guadalajara. So I mean, it was an impressive operation. But they are definitely west of the Magic Line. So then I was looking at passengers. Now you guys probably know more about this than I do, but I just looked at some of the old official guides, and the connection points are Chicago, St. Louis, or New Orleans. And I couldn't find many instances of national transcontinental sleeping cars. Is that correct, John? Who had them? New York Central and Pennsy?
Even the B&O even had them.
Did they? Okay.
Yeah, they even had them.
Okay.
New York Central, Pennsylvania, and the B&O. The Pennsylvania actually had a train called the Penn Texas, which had through cars all the way down
Okay.
to Texas. So that was one of the rare cases where you had a quote transcontinental
Okay.
railroad, even though it was in cooperation with the
Oh,
Missouri.
so that was after World War II to when?
Airplanes came in, that kind of changed.
So about the 60s?
You know, the question revolved around 6 stations in Chicago, and the B&O was in, you know, the southeastern corner at Grand Central.
Yeah,
And
oops, sorry.
so the airplanes coming in the late 50s and early 60s pretty well killed that.
Okay. Yeah, you look at it, I mean, all these depots, and I imagine there were some people who said, gee, if I take the Pennsy to Chicago and then take the Burlington, I only have to walk. I don't have to take one of their drays or whatever they call them. Where was it? Parmalee. Okay.
Later railway transfer.
Okay. But apparently it was fairly expensive, is that right?
Part of your ticket.
Oh, it was included in the ticket. Okay. All right, good.